What if the person you trusted most was planning your death? Harper Bellamy was about to give birth to her first child when her oxygen mysteriously stopped flowing. Both valves closed deliberately. Her husband, a billionaire tech CEO, watched it happen. Her uncle tried to expose the truth and ended up dead. The police refused to listen, and every time Harper thought she was safe, another trap closed around her. This is the true story of a woman who survived 3 murder attempts, lost everything, and fought back against a monster who wore a wedding ring. If you love stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things to survive, hit that like button. Drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe, because justice, it's about to get messy. Let's begin. The camera never lies, but the man behind it does. Donovan Steele held his iPhone steady, capturing his wife's radiant smile as she placed her hand on her swollen belly. The afternoon sunlight poured through their loft windows, painting Harper Bellamy in golden light. "Tell the camera how you're feeling, babe," Don said, his voice warm with apparent devotion. Harper laughed, brushing her dark hair behind her ear. "I feel incredible, scared, excited, ready. We're doing this our way. A home birth, just like my mother wanted for me before she passed." Don zoomed in on her face. "2 more weeks until we meet our little guy." What the camera didn't capture was the text message that had just buzzed in Don's pocket. 3 words from Vivian Cross, his corporate attorney and secret mistress. "Timeline approved. Proceed." Don uploaded the video to his phone's cloud storage, then immediately forwarded it to a private folder labeled Asset Protection Contingency. His $40 million problem had a due date, and time was running out. That had been yesterday. Now Harper gripped the edges of the bathtub, her knuckles white as another contraction seized her body. The water had gone cold. She'd been laboring for 6 hours, and something felt wrong. "Don," she called out, her voice strained. "Something's different. The contractions are too close. I need Jenna here now." Outside the bathroom door, Don pressed his phone to his ear, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's time. Do it now." He ended the call and pushed open the door, his face instantly transforming into concern. Hey, I'm here. Jenna's on her way. Just breathe." "Harper, breathe." But Harper wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the glass of water he'd brought her an hour ago, still sitting untouched on the vanity. The water she'd been too nauseated to drink. The water that contained 20 milligrams of Pitocin, carefully dissolved and completely undetectable. Don had learned from the best. Vivian Cross didn't just practice corporate law. She understood how to make problems disappear in ways that looked like unfortunate accidents. And Harper Bellamy, with her $40 million trust fund that would revert to Don upon her death before the Steele Technologies IPO, had become a very expensive problem. "The midwife's 20 minutes out," Don said, checking his watch. A Patek Philippe that Harper's inheritance had purchased. "You're doing amazing." Harper's water broke with a sudden rush. She gasped, grabbing Don's arm. "The baby's coming. Don, he's coming now. We can't wait." Don's jaw tightened. This wasn't the plan. The plan required Jenna to be present, to witness the equipment failure, to confirm the terrible accident. But babies, unlike corporate mergers, didn't follow schedules. Okay, he said, helping Harper out of the tub. "Let's get you to the birthing room." They'd converted their second bedroom into a peaceful space with soft lighting, a birthing pool, and 2 medical-grade oxygen tanks. Everything inspected and certified safe by Jenna just 3 days ago. Everything except the valves that had been manually closed the night before. When Harper was sleeping and Don had let Vivian into their home with his key, Harper settled into the birthing pool, breathing through contractions that were coming faster now. Harder. Her body knew what to do, even if her mind was beginning to panic. "Where's Jenna?" Harper panted. "Don, call her again." He pulled out his phone, pretending to dial. Straight to voicemail. Traffic must be bad." The contraction that hit next made Harper scream. Her body was pushing whether she was ready or not. And that's when she felt it. The lightheadedness, the way the room started to tilt. "Don, I can't breathe right. Something's wrong." He moved to the oxygen tanks, his performance flawless. "I'm getting you oxygen right now." He attached the mask, turned the valve, Nothing. What the hell? He moved to the backup tank. His movements quick but not panicked. Turned that valve. Still nothing. And that's when Harper's eyes rolled back. Harper, Harper. Don's shout was perfectly calibrated, loud enough to sound concerned, but not so loud the neighbors would hear. Not yet. Not until it was too late. But fate, as it turns out, doesn't always follow corporate timelines. Jenna Holt burst through the front door, her medical bag already open. She'd gotten Harper's earlier text about labor progressing and had left her previous appointment early. The scream she heard as she entered the apartment sent her into a dead run. What she found in that birthing room would haunt her for months. Harper, unconscious in the water. Don, holding an oxygen mask that wasn't delivering anything. And on the floor, barely visible, a small wrench that didn't belong in a birthing room. Jenna didn't think. She pulled Harper from the pool, started CPR, and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. I need an ambulance. Pregnant woman. Full term. Not breathing. Home birth gone wrong. Don stood frozen, watching his carefully constructed plan unravel. Watching $40 million slip away with every compression Jenna performed on his wife's chest. And watching, with growing dread, as Harper's eyes suddenly opened, gasping for air like a drowning woman breaking the surface. She was alive. For now, the ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and emergency protocols. Jenna had kept Harper breathing until the paramedics arrived, but barely. The baby's heart rate had dropped dangerously low. At Sacred Heart Medical Center, the emergency team moved with practiced precision. Dr. Marcus Webb, the attending physician, made the call immediately. Emergency C-section. We're losing them both. Harper's last conscious thought before the anesthesia took her was the image of Don's face as the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. He'd looked concerned. He'd held her hand. He'd whispered, I love you. But his eyes had been calculating something else entirely. 8 minutes later, Harper's son entered the world not with a cry of triumph, but with the weak mule of a baby who'd been deprived of oxygen for too long. The NICU team whisked him away before Harper could even see him. Dr. Webb looked at the surgical team. Mother's stable, baby's critical but alive. Someone get that equipment from the house. We need to document everything for the investigation. In the waiting room, Don sat with his head in his hands, the perfect image of a worried husband. When Jenna approached, he looked up with red-rimmed eyes. Is she alive? He asked. They both are, Jenna said quietly. Barely. Don's relief looked genuine. Jenna would remember that later, how convincing he'd been. How she'd actually felt sorry for him in that moment. What happened with those oxygen tanks, she asked. I checked them myself 3 days ago. Both were full. Both valves were functioning perfectly. Don shook his head. I don't know. Maybe a malfunction, or maybe I bumped something when I was setting up the room yesterday. This is my fault. No, Jenna said firmly. Equipment fails sometimes. It's why we have protocols, backups. This was just terrible luck. But as she walked away, something nagged at her. A detail that didn't fit. The wrench on the floor. The way both tanks had failed simultaneously. The statistical impossibility of it all. Harper woke 6 hours later to fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitors. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach and found it flat. Empty. Wrong. Your son is in the NICU, a nurse said gently. He's stable, small, but fighting. You can see him soon. What happened? Harper's voice was hoarse from the breathing tube. You had a medical emergency during labor. Oxygen deprivation. But you're both alive. And that's what matters. Don appeared in the doorway, carrying flowers. White roses. Harper's favorite. His eyes were bloodshot, his shirt wrinkled. He looked like a man who'd been through hell. Oh, thank God, he breathed, rushing to her bedside. Harper, I thought I'd lost you. He kissed her forehead, held her hand, played his part perfectly. And Harper, exhausted and traumatized, let herself believe in his performance. She needed to believe, because the alternative, that she'd almost died in her own home for reasons she didn't understand, was too terrifying to contemplate. The police want to talk to us, Dawn said softly. Standard procedure for any home birth emergency. They're calling it an equipment malfunction. Harper nodded weakly. Of course, an accident. Terrible luck, these things happened. Over the next 2 days, Harper began to believe the story. The police took their statements. The insurance company sent an investigator. Everyone concluded the same thing: faulty equipment, tragic circumstances, but no negligence. Dawn was attentive, bringing her favorite foods, updating her on their son's progress in the NICU, even sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her bed. He posted updates on social media about their miracle survival, and friends flooded their feeds with prayers and support. Harper felt grateful, lucky, blessed to be alive. That feeling lasted exactly 4 days. On day 5, Jenna came to visit during her lunch break. She brought a stuffed elephant for the baby and a troubled expression Harper immediately recognized. "Can we talk?" Jenna asked. Privately, Don, who'd been scrolling through his phone, looked up. "I should check on the baby anyway. Give you two some girl time." He kissed Harper's cheek and left, and Jenna watched him go with an expression Harper couldn't quite read. "What's wrong?" Harper asked. Jenna closed the door, then pulled a chair close to the bed. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Harper, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm. Can you do that?" Harper's heart began to race. "What's going on behind those oxygen tanks? I went back to your apartment yesterday with the equipment inspector. I had to know what went wrong." Jenna paused, choosing her words carefully. "Harper, both valves had been manually closed. Not broken, closed, and there were fresh tool marks on the valve handles." The room suddenly felt very cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this wasn't an accident. Someone tampered with your oxygen supply. Someone who had access to your home, who knew when you'd go into labor, who wanted it to look like equipment failure." Harper's mind immediately went to the place it always went when something went wrong. Her own fault. "Maybe I bumped them. Maybe when I was setting up the room." "You can't close these valves by bumping them. They require significant force and a tool to turn them completely off." "And Harper, there's something else." Jenna pulled out her phone and showed Harper a photo. Security footage timestamp from Harper's own home system. "I checked your security app. The system shows it was disarmed at 2 in the morning the night before your labor started, for exactly 17 minutes, then rearmed." Harper stared at the timestamp. She'd been asleep, and only 2 people had the alarm code: her and Don. "Someone came into your home while you were sleeping," Jenna continued. "Someone with your alarm code, and they had enough time to tamper with those tanks and leave no obvious trace." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Harper's hands began to shake. "You think Don—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't make the words real. "I think you need to ask yourself who benefits if you die, and I think you need to be very careful about who you trust." The door opened. Don walked in with 2 cups of coffee, his smile warm and loving. "They said our boy can come off the oxygen support tomorrow," he announced. "Isn't that amazing?" Harper looked at her husband, the man she'd married 3 years ago, the man she'd built a life with, and for the first time, she saw a stranger. "Amazing," she echoed, her voice hollow. That night, after Don left for a quick meeting at his office, Harper did something she'd never done before. She opened his laptop while he was gone. The password was their anniversary. Easy to remember. Easy to guess. What she found in his deleted emails made her blood run cold. A message thread with someone named V. Cross. Subject line: Asset Timeline Revised. Harper clicked on the most recent email, dated 1 week before her due date. The message was brief: confirm liquid asset transfer protocols aligned with market window, timeline pre-IPO closure, method established precedent 3 alpha. It was corporate speak, deliberately vague. But Harper had spent enough time around Don's business to recognize certain phrases: liquid asset transfer, her trust fund, market window, the Steel Technologies IPO, scheduled for 3 weeks from now. And that last phrase, established precedent 3 alpha, meant nothing to her. But it clearly meant something to Dean and this V. Cross person. Harper took photos of the emails with her phone. Her hands shook so badly she had to steady them against the desk. She heard footsteps in the hallway. Don was back. Harper closed the laptop, deleted her search history with shaking fingers, and climbed back into the hospital bed. When Don entered the room, she pretended to be asleep. But behind her closed eyelids, Harper's mind was racing. because she'd finally understood what Jenna had been trying to tell her. Her husband hadn't just tried to kill her. He'd planned it, and if she didn't act fast, he might try again. Harper had one person left in the world she thought she could trust. Uncle Malcolm, her mother's younger brother, a former FBI agent who'd retired 5 years ago after a career spent hunting white-collar criminals. They'd been estranged since Harper's wedding. Malcolm had warned her about Don, had seen something in him that Harper had been too in love to notice. They'd fought. Harper had chosen her husband over her uncle, and Malcolm had said he'd be there when she needed him. She needed him now. Harper made the call from a hospital payphone at 3 in the morning. When Don was sleeping in the chair beside her bed, she stood in the hallway in her hospital gown, feeding quarters into the ancient machine with trembling hands. "It's me," she said when Malcolm answered on the second ring. "I need help." 12 hours later, Malcolm Reeves walked into Harper's hospital room. He was 62 years old, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, and the relief Harper felt at seeing him almost made her cry. Don was at the office, finally going in after a week of playing devoted husband. He'd kissed Harper goodbye, promised to be back before dinner, and told her to rest. "Tell me everything," Malcolm said, pulling a chair close. "And I mean everything." Harper told him about the oxygen tanks, the closed valves, the deleted security footage, the cryptic emails, and finally, the thing that had been eating at her for days, Don's unusual calmness during the whole nightmare. Malcolm listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each detail. "How much is your trust fund worth?" he asked when she finished. "40 million. It's from my mother's estate. The terms are complicated, but the short version is if I die before age 35 without children, the money goes to my spouse. If I die after giving birth, my child inherits, with Don as trustee." Malcolm pulled out a leather notebook and started writing. "When's his company's IPO?" "2 weeks from now. Steel Technologies is going public. It's been in the works for 2 years. Don's been obsessed with it." "And how much of his company do you own?" Harper blinked. "I don't. We kept our finances mostly separate. I invested in his company early on, about 200,000, but I don't have shares. He said it was cleaner that way for the IPO process." Malcolm looked up from his notes. "Harper, did Don have you sign anything recently? Any documents about your trust fund or estate planning?" She thought back. "A few months ago. Yes, he said it was just updating our wills since we were having a baby. His lawyer drafted everything. I signed them at her office." "What was the lawyer's name?" "Vivian Cross. She's been Don's attorney for years. Corporate contracts, business stuff." Malcolm wrote down the name, underlining it twice. "This V. Cross from the emails. That's her." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Oh God," Harper whispered. "You think they're working together?" "I think," Malcolm said carefully, "that we need to look at this from a cold perspective. Who benefits from your death? Don gets 40 million plus control of your son's inheritance as trustee. That's substantial capital right before a major IPO. And if Don and this Vivian Cross have a relationship beyond professional?" "He wouldn't," Harper interrupted. But even as she said it, she remembered. Late-night meetings, weekends at the office, the way Don always seemed to smell faintly of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. Malcolm reached across and took her hand. "I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it from someone who loves you. This wasn't an accident. This was attempted murder. And until we know exactly what we're dealing with, you need to be very, very careful." "What do I do?" "First, you don't let on that you suspect anything. Keep playing the grateful wife. Second, you don't eat or drink anything Don brings you that isn't sealed. Third, you document everything. And fourth, you let me investigate." "Can we go to the police?" Malcolm shook his head. "Not yet. Right now we have suspicions and circumstantial evidence. We need proof. The kind of proof that will stand up in court and send Don to prison for a long time." Over the next week, while Harper recovered and their son grew stronger in the NICU, Malcolm went to work. He called in favors from his FBI days, hired a private investigator, and started building a case. What he found was damning. Don had taken out a life insurance policy on Harper 6 months ago, $5 million, with himself as beneficiary. He'd forged her signature on the application. Vivian Cross had drafted a series of legal documents that would funnel Harper's trust fund money into Dawn's company accounts upon her death, disguised as estate liquidation for business debt settlement. And most damning of all, financial records showed Dawn had paid Dr. Marcus Webb, the ER doctor who'd saved Harper's life, $150,000 3 days before Harper went into labor. The payment was listed as consulting fees from a shell company Malcolm traced back to Steel Technologies. Webb was the fail-safe, Malcolm explained, showing Harper the financial documents on his tablet. If the oxygen plan didn't work, Webb was supposed to make sure things went wrong at the hospital. But something happened. He helped save you instead. Why? Harper asked. Why would he do that? I'm going to find out. That afternoon, Malcolm paid a visit to Dr. Marcus Webb's office. The doctor agreed to meet him in the hospital parking garage, away from security cameras. Webb looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. I know about the money, Malcolm said. $150,000 from Dawn Steele. What was it for? Webb took a long drag, exhaled smoke into the cold air. He wanted me to make sure she didn't wake up from the C-section. Said it was a mercy, that she was brain damaged from oxygen deprivation and would want to die rather than live as a vegetable. But she wasn't brain damaged. No, Webb said quietly. She wasn't. When I got into that operating room and saw her vitals, saw that baby fighting to live, I couldn't do it. I couldn't kill a healthy woman and her child for money, no matter how much I owed. Owed who? Webb laughed bitterly. Gambling debts, to some very unfriendly people. Don knew about them somehow. He offered to pay them off if I helped him. I said yes because I was desperate. But I'm not a murderer. Malcolm pulled out his phone. I need you to repeat all of that on recording, and then I need you to testify. Webb's face went pale. He'll kill me. Or worse, he'll tell those people I didn't pay them back. I'm a dead man either way. Or, Malcolm said, you help us put him in prison, and I use my contacts to get you into witness protection. Your choice. Doctor. Webb stared at the cigarette burning between his fingers. Finally, Haughty, he nodded. Malcolm recorded his confession right there in the parking garage. 20 minutes of damning testimony that would unravel Dawn Steele's entire plan. That night, Malcolm came to Harper's hospital room with something close to triumph in his eyes. We've got him, he said, showing her the recording. Between this and the financial records, we have enough to file charges. Harper listened to Dr. Webb's confession, her hands clenched in her lap. When it finished, she looked at her uncle with tears streaming down her face. I married a monster. You married a liar, Malcolm corrected. But now we're going to make sure he pays for what he did. They made plans. Malcolm would take all the evidence to the district attorney first thing in the morning. Harper would file for divorce in an emergency restraining order simultaneously. And they'd go public with the story, make sure Dawn couldn't manipulate the narrative. Harper felt hope for the first time in weeks. It was almost over. Justice was coming. That night, she slept peacefully for the first time since the oxygen incident. She didn't know that 3 floors below, in the hospital security office, someone was watching her room on the monitors. Someone who'd been paid to keep Dawn informed of every visitor, every conversation. Someone who immediately called Dawn the moment Malcolm left and told him everything. The countdown to Harper's second nightmare had begun. Malcolm Reeves never made it to the district attorney's office. At 6:30 in the morning, Harper's phone rang, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Is this Harper Bellamy? The voice was professional, clinical. This is Officer Sarah Mitchell with the city police. I'm calling about your uncle, Malcolm Reeves. The words that followed felt like a physical blow. There's been an incident at his home. I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Reeves was found deceased approximately 2 hours ago. It appears to be a home invasion that turned violent. Harper's phone slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. No, this wasn't happening. Don burst into the room minutes later, his face a mask of concern. Harper, what's wrong? The nurse said you were screaming. She couldn't speak, couldn't form the words. Malcolm was dead. The only person who'd believed her. The only person who had the evidence. Baby, you're scaring me. What happened? Harper looked up at her husband through tears, and in that moment she saw it. the briefest flicker of satisfaction in his eyes before the concerned expression returned. He knew. He knew before she told him. My uncle, she managed. He's dead. Someone broke into his house. Dawn's arms came around her, holding her as she sobbed. Oh God, Harper, I'm so sorry. That's horrible. His embrace felt like a trap. The police ruled Malcolm's death a robbery gone wrong. His laptop was missing. His filing cabinet had been rifled through. His safe had been emptied. And most conveniently, all the evidence he'd gathered about Don Steele had vanished. The recording of Dr. Webb's confession, gone, Sarton. The financial documents showing Don's payments, gone. The timeline Malcolm had constructed, the proof he'd assembled so carefully, all of it, gone. Harper tried to tell the police what Malcolm had been investigating. They listened politely, took notes, and then gently suggested that grief was making her imagine conspiracies. Mrs. Steele, Detective Frank Morrison said, his voice kind but dismissive, your uncle was investigating some business matters, but there's no evidence connecting his death to your husband. The break-in appears random. Wrong place. Wrong time. What Harper did not know Detective Morrison had been Don's roommate at Yale. They'd been fraternity brothers, best men at each other's weddings. And Don had called in that favor the night Malcolm started investigating. Harper tried going to Dr. Webb next, if he could repeat his confession, if he could testify, but when she called the hospital, they told her Dr. Webb had taken an unexpected leave of absence. No forwarding information, no return date. She tracked down his home address through Malcolm's notes. The house was empty. A neighbor said Webb had left in a hurry 2 days ago, right after a man in an expensive suit had visited him. The man, the neighbor remembered, had been driving a silver Tesla, just like the one registered to Steele Technologies. Harper's world was collapsing. Every piece of evidence had been systematically eliminated. Every ally had been silenced or disappeared. And now she was alone in the hospital with a man who'd tried to kill her once and had just gotten away with murdering her uncle. She needed a new plan, but first, she needed to protect herself. That night, Harper called Paige Drummond, an investigative journalist who'd worked with her mother 20 years ago. Paige was old-school cynical, persistent, and allergic to cover-ups. They met in the hospital cafeteria at midnight when Don was home sleeping. I remember your mother, Paige said, stirring coffee that had been sitting on the burner for 12 hours. She taught me everything about following the money. What's going on, Harper? Harper told her everything. The oxygen tanks, Malcolm's investigation, his convenient murder, Dr. Webb's disappearance, and most important, Don's upcoming IPO. You think he's killing people for capital, Paige said. It wasn't a question. I think he planned my death to access my trust fund before the IPO launch. When that failed, he's been systematically eliminating anyone who knows the truth. Paige pulled out a recorder. Tell me everything again, all of it, and I'll start digging. They talked for 2 hours. Paige took notes, asked sharp questions, and by the end, she was nodding slowly. This is going to take time to prove, she warned. But I've spent 20 years exposing corporate criminals. If Don Steele is dirty, I'll find the proof. You just need to stay alive long enough for me to do it. Harper went back to her hospital room feeling something close to hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Someone believed her. The feeling lasted exactly 18 hours. Harper was being discharged the next day. She'd gotten the okay to take her son home from the NICU. Don was there, playing the dutiful husband, carrying the car seat and diaper bag, helping her into their Mercedes SUV. They were driving home on the winding canyon road when Harper noticed Don was going too fast. Slow down, she said, one hand protectively on the car seat beside her. Sorry, distracted, Don said, but he didn't slow down. The curve appeared suddenly. Don jerked the wheel. The car swerved wildly. And that's when Harper realized the brakes weren't working. They were going 60 miles per hour on a road with a 1,000-foot drop and no guardrail. And the brakes were gone. Harper screamed. Don fought the wheel. The car went into a skid. They hit the embankment at the curve's edge. The airbags deployed with explosive force. The car rolled once, twice, and came to rest on its side, balanced precariously on the edge of the drop. For a moment, there was only silence and dust and the hiss of the engine. Then Harper heard her son crying from the car seat, alive. She was pinned by the deployed airbag, but she could move her arms. She reached back, checked her son. He was okay, terrified and crying, but okay. Don was unconscious beside her, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. Harper's hands found her phone. She called 911 with shaking fingers. We've been in an accident. Canyon Road. Mile marker 12. We went off the road. My baby's in the car. Please hurry. The emergency response took 20 minutes. By the time they arrived, Don had woken up, disoriented and seemingly as terrified as Harper. The paramedics extracted them carefully. Both Harper and her son were miraculously unhurt beyond bruises. Don had a concussion and needed stitches. But when the tow truck driver examined the car, he called the police immediately. Brake lines were cut, he told the officer quietly. Clean cut, done with tools. This wasn't an accident. Harper heard him from the ambulance. She looked at Don, who was being treated by paramedics 20 feet away. He was staring right at her, and this time he wasn't even pretending to hide the calculation in his eyes. 2 attempts on her life, her uncle dead, and now even the police couldn't ignore the pattern. But Don had one more card to play. That night, from his hospital bed, Don called a press conference. I'm devastated to announce, he said, his voice breaking at all the right moments, that someone is trying to destroy my family. First, the horrible oxygen incident during my wife's labor. Then the tragic death of her uncle. Now someone has sabotaged our car, putting my wife and infant son at risk. I'm offering a $1 million reward for information leading to the arrest of whoever is behind these attacks. The story went viral within hours. Sympathy poured in for the tech CEO whose family was being targeted. The narrative was perfect: Don as the protective husband, Harper as the traumatized victim, both of them under siege by some unknown enemy. And Harper, watching the press conference from her own hospital room, finally understood. Don wasn't just trying to kill her. He was systematically destroying her credibility, making sure that if she ever accused him, she'd look paranoid and unstable. The grieving niece, the postpartum mother, the woman seeing conspiracy everywhere. He was gaslighting her on a national scale. That night, Harper made a decision. She couldn't fight Don head on. She'd already lost that battle, but she could do something he'd never expect. She could disappear. At 3 in the morning, while Don was sleeping in his hospital room and their son was being monitored in the nursery, Harper checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice. She took nothing but her phone and the clothes she'd been wearing during the accident, and she called the one person she hoped could still help her. Paige Drummond answered on the first ring. I need to disappear, Harper said, and I need you to help me prove what he's done before he kills me. Where are you, the hospital parking garage? I have maybe 10 minutes before Don realizes I'm gone. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. 15 minutes later, Harper climbed into Paige's Honda, leaving behind her life, her son in protective NICU custody, and any illusion of safety. What's the plan? Paige asked, pulling out of the parking lot. Harper's voice was steady despite the fear. We make Don think he's won. We let him believe I've run scared. And while he's celebrating, we find proof that even his fraternity brother detective can't ignore. That's dangerous. He's already tried to kill me 3 times, Harper said. How much more dangerous can it get? As it turned out, she was about to find out. Paige Drummond's apartment was a studio in the older part of town where nobody asked questions. Harper spent the first night on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. Her phone buzzed constantly. Don, calling, then texting, then leaving voicemails that progressed from concerned to frantic to coldly angry. Harper, where are you? The hospital says you left. Call me back. Your son needs you. That last message was the knife that twisted deepest. Her son, still in the NICU, being cared for by nurses while his mother hid in a stranger's apartment and his father plotted murder. Don't answer, Paige warned. Not yet. First, we need insurance. They spent the next 3 days building their case. Paige had contacts everywhere: courthouse clerks, corporate whistleblowers, forensic accountants who owed her favors. She called in every single one. What emerged was a portrait of Don Steele that Harper had never seen. Steele Technologies wasn't the innovative company Don claimed. It was a house of cards built on inflated valuations, cooked books, and promises that technology couldn't keep. The IPO wasn't a triumph. It was a desperate cash grab before everything collapsed. And Harper's trust fund was meant to be the capital that kept the fraud going just long enough for Don to cash out and disappear. He's not just trying to kill you for money, Page explained, showing Harper the forensic analysis. He's trying to kill you to save himself from prison. If this IPO fails, investors will investigate. They'll find the fraud. He needed your $40 million to make the numbers look legitimate long enough to go public. Harper felt sick. How did I not see this? Because he's good at what he does. Charm, misdirection, and just enough of the truth mixed with lies to make it all believable. On day 4, they got their first real break. One of Page's sources at the courthouse pulled public records showing Don's property holdings. Among them, a cabin in the mountains registered under Vivian Cross's name, but paid for through Don's shell company. They've been hiding their relationship, Page said. But property records don't lie. They drove to the cabin that night, a 2-hour journey into the mountains. The place was dark, apparently empty. Page picked the lock while Harper kept watch, and they slipped inside. What they found was better than they'd hoped. A laptop left carelessly open on the dining table, still logged into Vivian Cross's email account. And in those emails, the entire conspiracy laid bare. Messages between Vivian and Don discussing the Harper problem, multiple timeline documents for asset liquidation, and most damning, a message thread titled Contingency Planning that detailed exactly how to make Harper's death look like a home birth accident. Harper photographed every single email with shaking hands. This was it. This was proof even Detective Morrison couldn't ignore. They were almost done when headlights swept across the windows. "Someone's coming," Page hissed. They barely made it out the back door before a car pulled into the driveway. Through the trees, Harper watched Don and Vivian step out, laughing about something. She'd never seen Don look so relaxed, so genuinely happy. With another woman, while Harper was in hiding, terrified for her life. The rage that filled Harper in that moment was clarifying. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for justice. They made it back to the car and drove away before Don and Vivian went inside. But as they descended the mountain road, Harper made a mistake. She called Don. "Where's my son?" she demanded when he answered. There was a pause, then Don's voice, cold and amused. "Harper, I was wondering when you'd resurface. Your son is fine, better than fine. Actually, the court granted me temporary full custody this morning. Seems disappearing without warning and checking out of the hospital. AMA doesn't make you look like a stable parent." Harper's blood ran cold. "You can't do that." "I just did. Where are you? Come home, and we can work this out. I'm worried about you. Your postpartum depression seems to be getting worse." "I don't have postpartum depression. That's not what my psychiatrist's evaluation says, or the statements from 3 nurses who witnessed your erratic behavior at the hospital. Come home. Harper, get help, or lose your son forever." He hung up. Harper stared at the phone, her hands shaking so badly Page had to pull over. "He's taking my son," Harper whispered. "He tried to kill me, and now he's taking my son." "We have the evidence," Page reminded her. "Those emails prove everything. Then we go to the police. Now, tonight." But when they arrived at the police station, Detective Morrison greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Steele, we've been looking for you. Your husband filed a missing persons report. He's very concerned. I'm here to report attempted murder," Harper said. "Multiple attempts. And I have proof." She showed him the photographs of Vivian's emails, laid out the timeline, explained everything. Morrison looked at the evidence with the same polite attention he'd shown before. Then he set the photos down and folded his hands. "Mrs. Steele, child, I'm going to be honest with you. These emails, if they're even real and not fabricated, don't prove attempted murder. They're vague business discussions that could mean anything. And the fact that you broke into private property to obtain them makes them inadmissible in court. They're discussing how to kill me. They're discussing business strategies using corporate jargon. I'm sorry, but this isn't the smoking gun you think it is." Harper felt the room tilt. "You're protecting him. You're his friend. And you're protecting him. Morrison's expression hardened. I'm doing my job. And my job right now is to tell you that your husband is waiting outside with his attorney to take you home. You have two choices. You can come voluntarily and seek the help you clearly need, or I can have you placed on a psychiatric hold for your own safety. It was a trap, a perfectly legal trap. If Harper went with Dean, she'd be under his control. If she refused, she'd be locked in a psychiatric facility, which would only support Dawn's narrative that she was unstable. Paige stepped forward. She's not going anywhere without a lawyer. And who are you, Paige Drummond, investigative journalist? And I'm publishing a story tomorrow about police corruption and cover-ups. Detective Morrison, isn't it true that you and Don Steele were fraternity brothers at Yale? Morrison's face went red. That has nothing to do with this investigation, doesn't it? Because it looks a lot like you're protecting your old friend from a murder investigation. There is no murder investigation because there was no attempted murder, Morrison snapped. Now, Miss Drummond, unless you want to be arrested for interfering with police business, I suggest you step back. The door opened. Dawn walked in, flanked by Vivian Cross in her sharp attorney suit. Harper, Tuayo, Dawn said, his voice gentle. Please come home. Let's get you the help you need. Harper looked at her husband, at Detective Morrison, at Vivian's satisfied smile. She was trapped, and everyone in this room knew it. But Harper had learned something in the past weeks. Sometimes the only way forward was through, I'll come home, she said quietly. But I want to see my son first. Dawn's smile was triumphant. Of course, he's at the house with a nurse. Let's go. As they left the police station, Paige caught Harper's eye. A question, are you sure? Harper gave the tiniest nod. She wasn't sure of anything. But she knew one thing: she couldn't fight Don from prison or a psychiatric ward. She had to get close to him again, had to make him think he'd won. And then, somehow, she had to find a way to destroy him before he destroyed her. The drive home was silent. Don drove, Harper in the passenger seat, Vivian following in her own car, the perfect triangle of conspiracy. When they arrived at the house where Harper had almost died, Don helped her out of the car with exaggerated care. Welcome home, he said. And Harper, playing her part, let him lead her inside like a prisoner walking voluntarily into her cell. The next 2 weeks were psychological warfare disguised as recovery. Don hired a live and psychiatric nurse named Brenda who monitored Harper's every movement. He installed cameras in every room except the bathroom. He controlled her phone, her computer, her access to the outside world. It's for your safety, he explained to concerned friends who called. She's been through so much trauma, we just want to make sure she heals properly. Harper played along. She took the antidepressants Brenda gave her. Though she secretly spit them out later, she attended virtual therapy sessions with a psychiatrist that Don had carefully selected. She acted grateful, compliant, broken. But inside she was watching, learning, planning. Her son, now named Connor by Don without Harper's input, was kept in a nursery on the other side of the house. Harper was allowed supervised visits 3 times a day for 30 minutes each. It was torture, holding her baby while knowing the clock was ticking. You'll get more time once you're stable, Don promised. Once the psychiatrist clears you. Harper knew the truth. She'd never be cleared. The psychiatrist was on Don's payroll, just like Brenda, just like Detective Morrison. The diagnosis would always be incomplete recovery, ongoing risk, needs continued supervision. Don was building an airtight case for permanent custody, and once he had it, once Harper was legally declared unfit, she knew what would come next. Another accident, this one final, on day 12 of her captivity. Harper's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She was in the bathroom, the only place without cameras. When she saw it, Paige here, new phone, don't respond. Just listen. I found something. Malcolm backed up all his evidence to a cloud drive before he died. Password protected. But I cracked it. We have everything. Webb's confession, financial records, timeline, meeting tomorrow. 2 p.m., Harper's coffee shop on Vine. Make an excuse to leave the house. This ends now. Harper read the message 3 times, memorizing every word. Then she deleted it and flushed her phone's cache. Hope, real, tangible hope. She just had to survive, one more day. That night, Dawn came to her room. Harper was in bed, pretending to read. Brenda was downstairs. "How are you feeling?" Dawn asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Better," Harper lied. "The medication is helping." "Good. I've been thinking. Once you're fully recovered, maybe we could renew our vows. Start fresh. Put all this nightmare behind us." Harper looked at the man she'd once loved, really looked at him, and realized there was nothing behind his eyes but calculation. There never had been. She'd just been too in love to see it. "I'd like that," she said. Dawn leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's a big day. The psychiatrist is coming for an in-person evaluation. If it goes well, we can start talking about you getting more time with Connor." After he left, Harper lay in the dark, her mind racing. The evaluation was a setup. She knew it. Dawn would make sure the psychiatrist found her still unstable. Still a risk. She had to get out of the house tomorrow. Had to meet Paige. This was her last chance. The next morning, Harper woke with a plan. It was desperate and risky, but it was all she had. At 1:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the psychiatrist was scheduled to arrive, Harper staged a panic attack. A big one, hyperventilating, crying, the works. Brenda rushed in, concerned. "Harper, what's wrong? And I need air." Harper gasped. "I can't breathe in here. Please, just a walk. 5 minutes outside, please." Brenda hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, but I'm coming with you. And we stay in the yard." It wasn't perfect, but it was something. They went outside. Harper walked around the garden, making a show of breathing deeply, calming down. And when Brenda's phone rang and she turned away to answer it, Harper ran. She sprinted down the driveway, through the gate, and into the street. Behind her, Brenda shouted, but Harper didn't stop. She ran for 3 blocks until she reached the bus stop. A bus was just pulling up. Harper jumped on, gasping. The driver looked concerned. "Miss, are you okay?" "I'm fine," Harper lied. "Just late." She rode the bus for 20 minutes, constantly checking over her shoulder, then got off 2 blocks from Harper's coffee shop. The irony of the name wasn't lost on her. Paige was waiting in a back booth, laptop open. "You made it," she breathed. "I wasn't sure you would. I have maybe 30 minutes before Dawn realizes I'm gone." "Show me." Paige turned the laptop around. On screen, Malcolm's backup drive, fully restored. "Everything's here. Webb's video confession. The financial forensics proving Dawn paid him. The emails between Dawn and Vivian planning your death. Even security footage from the cabin showing them together." Harper's hands shook as she scrolled through the files. "This is enough. This has to be enough." "It is. I've already contacted the FBI. Not local police, federal. They're opening an investigation into Dawn's company fraud, and your attempted murder case is part of it. They want to meet with you tomorrow." "Dawn won't let me leave the house again." "You're not going back to that house," Paige said firmly. "You're coming with me, right now, Sturfuo. We're going straight to the FBI field office. They'll put you in protective custody until Dawn is arrested." It was the smart play, the safe play. But Harper thought about Connor, back at the house with Dawn. If she disappeared again, Dawn would run. He'd take Connor and disappear, and Harper would never see her son again. "I can't," she said. "Not without my son. Harper. I can't leave him with that monster. What if Dawn realizes it's over? What if he runs or, God, what if he hurts Connor?" Paige's expression softened. "Okay, then we do this smart. You go back, you act normal, and tomorrow morning, the FBI makes their move. They'll arrest Dawn at his office. Away from Connor, you'll be safe at home with federal agents there to protect you." Harper nodded slowly. It made sense. 24 more hours. She could survive 24 more hours. She didn't know that outside the coffee shop, a car was parked with tinted windows. Inside it sat Travis Cole, Dawn's business partner, the man who'd been feeding Dawn information about Harper's movements through a tracking app Dawn had secretly installed on her phone. The man who immediately called Dawn the moment he saw Harper enter the coffee shop. Harper returned to the house 45 minutes after she'd fled. Brenda was frantic. Dawn was cold with fury. and the psychiatrist had already left, noting in her report, patient demonstrates flight risk and continuing instability. Where did you go? Don demanded. I just needed air. I'm sorry. I panicked. Don stared at her for a long moment. Then his face softened into concern. You're not well, Harper. I think we need to look at inpatient treatment. No, Harper said quickly. Please, I'll do better. I promise. That night, Don made his final move. At 2 a.m., while Harper was sleeping, he entered her room. In his hand was a syringe filled with enough sedative to keep her unconscious for 12 hours. I'm sorry, Don, he whispered, though Harper couldn't hear him. But you're becoming too much of a liability. He injected the sedative into her IV line, the one Brenda had installed for emergency medication. Harper would wake up in a psychiatric facility, legally committed by her concerned husband. By the time anyone found Malcolm's evidence, Harper would be too heavily medicated and legally compromised to testify. Don had won. Except for one thing he didn't know. Harper hadn't been sleeping. She'd been pretending, waiting to see what Don would do. And the moment the sedative hit her bloodstream, she triggered the emergency alert on the medical monitoring app Paige had secretly installed on her phone. The alert that went directly to the FBI. The countdown to Don's arrest had just accelerated by 12 hours. And this time, there would be no escape. Harper woke up in a hospital room, but not a psychiatric facility. Sacred Heart Medical Center. Again. Special Agent Rachel Matthews of the FBI sat in the chair beside her bed. Mrs. Steele, you're safe now. Your husband is in federal custody. Harper tried to sit up, her head spinning from whatever Don had injected. My son, where's Connor? With Child Protective Services temporarily. He's safe. Your husband tried to commit you to a psychiatric facility last night using forged medical documents. When our agents arrived at your home at 4 a.m. pursuant to our investigation, they found you unconscious with enough sedatives in your system to keep you under for days. Harper's relief was so intense she started crying. He was going to do it. He was really going to lock me away. He tried, but thanks to the evidence Ms. Drummond provided and your emergency alert, we moved faster than he anticipated. Agent Matthews pulled out a tablet. I need you to walk me through everything. From the beginning. For the next 3 hours, Harper told her story. Every detail, every close call, every moment of manipulation. When she finished, Agent Matthews nodded grimly. Your husband is facing federal charges for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, forgery, and about 15 other counts. His attorney, Vivian Cross, is also in custody. They're both cooperating, which means they're blaming each other. What about Dr. Webb? We found him. He's agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence. His gambling debts were real, but Don exploited them. Over the next week, the case became national news, not because Don spun it that way, but because the truth finally came out. Paige's article ran first tech CEO's murder plot, how Don Steele tried to kill his wife for her trust fund. Then other journalists picked it up. Then cable news. Then social media exploded. The evidence was overwhelming. Malcolm's recordings, Webb's testimony, the emails between Don and Vivian, the financial paper trail, the tampered oxygen tanks, finally tested by federal forensics who confirmed they'd been deliberately disabled. Public opinion, which had been so carefully manipulated in Don's favor, turned on him completely. But the real reckoning came in court. Harper sat in the front row of the federal courthouse, holding Connor in her arms. She got an emergency custody restored the day after Don's arrest. Now she was here to watch justice finally catch up to him. Don was let in wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed. He looked smaller somehow, less powerful. The charm that had once captivated her was gone, replaced by barely concealed rage. Vivian Cross entered separately, also in custody. She wouldn't meet Don's eyes. The prosecution's case was devastating. They played Webb's video confession, showing the doctor admitting Don paid him to let Harper die during surgery. They presented the oxygen tanks, with forensic analysis proving they'd been tampered with. They showed the financial records proving Don's company was built on fraud, and Harper's trust fund was meant to be the capital that kept the scheme afloat. And then they played the piece of evidence that destroyed any remaining doubt. Malcolm had given Harper a baby monitor before he died, just a gift for his niece. He'd said, What he hadn't told her was that it had a recording feature that backed up audio to cloud storage. The monitor had been in the nursery the night before Harper went into labor, and it had recorded Don and Vivian's final planning session. The courtroom fell silent as their voices filled the space. Vivian, are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. Don, I'm sure. The oxygen tanks are ready. When she goes into labor, both will fail. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, it'll be too late. Jenna will find equipment malfunction, Harper will be gone, and $40 million will be mine. Vivian, what about the baby Don if he survives? I'm his father, but I control his inheritance as trustee. If he doesn't, well, that's $40 million I get outright. Either way, I win. Vivian, and no one will suspect, Don. Why would they? I'm the grieving husband, the devastated father, and you're my brilliant attorney who helps me rebuild. In 6 months, we can go public with our relationship. By then, everyone will have forgotten about Harper. The recording ended. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Harper looked at Don. He was staring at the floor, his jaw clenched. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the verdict was read, Don finally looked at Harper. She met his gaze steadily, holding their son close. She'd won. At sentencing, the judge was merciless. Mr. Steele, you attempted to murder your wife in one of her most vulnerable moments. You killed her uncle to hide your crimes. You manipulated law enforcement and tried to have your wife institutionalized when she fought back. You have shown no remorse, only anger at being caught. The judge paused, looking down at Don with open disgust. I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison for attempted murder, to be served consecutively with a 10-year sentence for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. You will be eligible for parole in 30 years. Don was 68 years old. He'd be nearly 70 when he got out, if he lived that long. Vivian Cross received a lighter sentence, 15 years, in exchange for her cooperation. Her legal career was over. Dr. Webb, who'd ultimately helped save Harper instead of killing her, received 5 years probation and community service. As Harper left the courthouse that day, reporters swarmed her. Mrs. Steele, how does it feel to get justice? Harper thought about that question. Justice, was that what this was? Her uncle was still dead. She'd lost months of Connor's infancy. She'd lived with PTSD for years. And Don, even behind bars, had still stolen so much from her. But she was alive. Connor was safe. And the truth was finally out. It feels like breathing again, Harper said simply. That night in her new apartment, far from the house where Don had tried to kill her, Harper held Connor and whispered promises. You'll never grow up in a home with lies. You'll never wonder if love is real or calculated. And you'll always, always know that your mother fought like hell to keep you safe. Connor gurgled, grabbing her finger. Harper smiled, her first real smile in months. The nightmare was over, or so she thought. 1 year later, Harper had rebuilt her life piece by piece. She'd sold the house, unable to bear living in the place where Don had tried to murder her. Her new apartment was small but bright. With security cameras, Harper controlled herself. Her architecture firm had taken her back after she'd proven she hadn't been unstable, just targeted. She'd even won an award for a sustainable housing project, showing up to the ceremony with Connor strapped to her chest in a baby carrier. Paige had written a book about the case, The Oxygen Files: How One Woman Survived Her Husband's Perfect Murder Plan. It was a bestseller. Harper got a cut of the profits, which she put into a trust for Connor that only she controlled. But some wounds don't heal clean. Harper couldn't sleep without checking the locks 3 times. She couldn't go near oxygen tanks without her heart racing. And she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, even from prison, Don was still watching. That feeling intensified when she received the letter. It came on a Tuesday, delivered to her office in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with neat handwriting. Harper, I hope this letter finds you well. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened between us, and I want you to know I hold no ill will. You did what you had to do, and I respect that. In fact, I admire it. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. I wanted you to know that I've made arrangements, even from in here, to ensure Connor is protected. There are people watching over him, friends of mine who owe me favors. Consider it my gift to my son. After all, I'm still his father. No court can change that. We'll see each other again someday. Harper, I promise. Until then, be careful who you trust. Affectionately, Don. Harper's hands shook as she read it. She immediately called Agent Matthews. He's sending me letters from prison, threatening ones. Matthews came to her office within the hour, read the letter, and frowned. It's carefully worded to sound concerned rather than threatening. Legally, there's nothing here we can prosecute, but I'll make sure the prison monitors his communications more carefully. He says he has people watching Connor. It's likely a psychological game. Don's in federal prison, maximum security. He has no power anymore. But Harper knew Don, yeah, he always had contingency plans. That night, she installed 3 more cameras around her apartment. She hired a security firm to do background checks on Connor's daycare staff. She started taking different routes to work every day, and she kept looking over her shoulder. A month later, Travis Cole, Don's former business partner, reached out through Paige. He wants to meet with you, Paige said over coffee. Says he has information about Don's prison activities. Why would I trust him? Because Travis is the one who was feeding Malcolm information before he died. He was the insider who wanted Don's company. He's offering to tell you everything about Don's ongoing schemes in exchange for immunity from any remaining charges. Harper met Travis in a neutral location, a busy restaurant with plenty of witnesses. Travis looked older, worn down by guilt. I didn't know Don was going to kill Malcolm, he said immediately. I thought Malcolm would just expose the fraud. Don would go to prison, and I'd take over the company. I didn't know Don was capable of murder until it was too late. What do you want? To warn you, Don's been making calls from prison, using other inmates' phone privileges. He's been in contact with Vivian. Harper's blood ran cold. How she's in prison too. Different facility, but they have mutual contacts. Don's convinced Vivian that if they both get their sentences appealed, they can still salvage something. He's building an appeal case claiming you fabricated evidence, that Malcolm's recordings were altered, that you're a vengeful ex-wife who destroyed an innocent man. That's insane. The evidence is overwhelming. Evidence can be challenged with enough money and time, and Don's been liquidating hidden assets, paying for expensive appellate lawyers. He's not done fighting, Harper, and he won't be until he's destroyed you the way you destroyed him. Harper left the meeting feeling sick. She'd thought it was over. She'd thought justice meant safety. She'd been wrong. That night, she had the nightmare again. The one where she's in the bathtub, in labor, and the oxygen masks don't work. But this time, when she looks up, it's not Dawn standing there. It's her own reflection, suffocating herself. She woke up screaming, Connor crying in his crib in response. I'm sorry, baby, she whispered, picking him up. Mommy just had a bad dream. But it wasn't just a dream. It was the reality she'd been living with for over a year. The constant fear, the knowledge that somewhere in a federal prison, her ex-husband was plotting and planning. The question wasn't if he'd strike again. It was when, and whether Harper would see it coming. 3 months after Travis's warning, something shifted. Vivian Cross, serving her 15-year sentence at a women's correctional facility in Pennsylvania, requested a meeting with Harper through her attorney. Why would she want to talk to me? Harper asked Agent Matthews. She says she has information about Don's plans, and she wants to trade it for a reduced sentence. Harper knew this was a trap. Everything involving Don and Vivian was a trap. But she also knew she couldn't spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. She agreed to the meeting. The visitation room at the correctional facility was gray and sterile. Vivian looked different than she had at trial. Thinner, older. The sharp edges of her corporate armor worn away by prison life. Thank you for coming, Vivian said as Harper sat down across from her. What do you want? Vivian leaned forward, her voice low. I want to help you put Don away forever. Really away, not just physically. I want to break his power completely. Why, Wester? Because I'm done being his pawn. He used me, Harper, the same way he used you. And now that I'm in here and he's in there, He's been trying to orchestrate an appeal that throws me under the bus completely. He's claiming I acted alone, that I manipulated him, that he's the real victim. Harper laughed bitterly. Charming. I have recordings, Vivian continued, from prison. Don doesn't know I kept making copies of everything we discussed. Even after we were arrested, phone calls where he outlines his appeal strategy, plans to intimidate witnesses, even discussions about accessing hidden money to pay for hit jobs on key people who testified against him. Harper's stomach dropped. Hit jobs. He's desperate, and desperate people do desperate things. I'm offering you these recordings in exchange for a recommendation for early parole. I served 7 years instead of 15. And I'm supposed to trust you because Vivian pulled out an envelope she'd been allowed to bring in, already inspected by guards. Inside were transcripts of prison phone calls. Harper read through them, her horror growing with each page. Don discussing paying someone to handle Dr. Webb, who'd testified against him. Don planning ways to get Harper declared an unfit mother, even from prison, through false allegations and paid witnesses. Don, in his own words, refusing to let go of the control he'd lost. Why are you really doing this? Harper asked. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Because I loved him, really loved him. And he looked me in the eye 3 weeks ago during our last allowed phone call and told me I was always disposable, that I was just a tool he used. And now that I'm not useful anymore, I mean nothing to him. There were tears in Vivian's eyes. Real ones. Harper thought. I can't undo what I did, Vivian said. I can't bring your uncle back. I can't give you back the months you lost with your son, but I can make sure Don never hurts anyone again. Not you, not Connor, not the next woman foolish enough to believe his lies. Harper studied the woman who'd helped plan her murder and made a decision. I'll take your recordings, but I'm not recommending early parole. You helped him try to kill me. You deserve every year of your sentence. Vivian's face fell, but she nodded. Fair enough, but take these anyway, because it's the right thing to do. And maybe, someday, that'll count for something. She slid a USB drive across the table, hidden inside the envelope. The guards hadn't found it in their inspection. Harper took it. The recordings were everything Vivian promised. Clear evidence that Don was continuing to commit crimes from prison conspiracy, witness intimidation, solicitation of murder. Agent Matthews brought the evidence to the U.S. attorney, who immediately filed new charges. Don's sentence was extended by another 15 years. He'd be in prison for 45 years total. He was 38 years old when he went in. He'd be 83 if he ever got out. More importantly, his appellate case collapsed. There would be no early release. No legal technicality to save him. Don Steele's story would end behind bars. But Harper's story was just beginning. She testified at Don's new sentencing hearing. This time, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Don Steele tried to kill me in my most vulnerable moment, she told the court. He murdered my uncle. He manipulated everyone around him. But what he couldn't kill was my will to survive. My son will grow up knowing his mother fought for him. And Don will grow old knowing he lost everything while trying to destroy a woman who refused to break. The judge added the new charges to Don's existing sentence. 45 years became the final number. As Harper left the courthouse that day, a reporter asked her the same question they'd asked a year ago. How does it feel to finally get justice? This time, Harper had a different answer. It feels like I can finally stop looking over my shoulder. That wasn't entirely true. She still checked the locks, still had nightmares, still flinched when she saw an oxygen tank. But Connor was 3 years old now, laughing and running and calling her Mama. He'd never remember the nightmare of his birth. He'd only know the life Harper built for them afterward. A life of safety, truth, and the quiet strength that comes from surviving something meant to destroy you. Harper had won, not just in court. She'd won her life back. 5 years after Don's final sentencing, Harper stood in the living room of her custom-designed home, watching Connor play in the backyard through floor-to-ceiling windows. The house was everything the loft had never been open. Bright, with security designed into its bones rather than installed as an afterthought, solar panels on the roof, rainwater collection systems. Harper had poured her talent and her trauma into creating something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. "Mama, watch this," Connor called. Climbing to the top of the play structure Harper had commissioned from a sustainable lumber company. "I'm watching, baby." He was 8 now, with Dawn's dark hair but Harper's eyes. Every day, she looked for signs of his father in him and was relieved to find mostly herself. Connor was kind, curious, empathetic, nothing like the man whose DNA he carried. Harper had been careful never to poison Connor against his father. When he asked about Don, she told him age-appropriate truths. "Your father made very bad choices that hurt people. He's in prison because of those choices. But that doesn't mean you're bad. You get to choose who you become." Connor had nodded seriously, processing this, then asked if they could get a dog. They'd gotten a golden retriever named Scout. Harper's phone buzzed. A message from Paige, who'd become not just a professional ally, but a genuine friend. "Drinks tonight, I have news." They met at their usual spot, a quiet bar where the bartender knew to give Harper ginger ale instead of alcohol. She hadn't touched alcohol since the trial. "What's the news?" Harper asked. Paige slid a newspaper across the bar, a small article in the crime section. "Don Steele, 53, died yesterday at Federal Correctional Facility following complications from pneumonia. He'd been serving a 45-year sentence for attempted murder and conspiracy charges. He was 8 years into his sentence." Harper stared at the article, read it 3 times. Don was dead. "How do you feel?" Paige asked gently. Harper didn't know how she felt. Relief, grief, anger that he'd escaped justice by dying. "I feel," she said slowly, "like I can finally exhale." That night, after Connor was asleep, Harper did something she hadn't done in years. She pulled out the ball of photos from her marriage, the ones she'd kept hidden in the back of her closet. She looked at images of a younger version of herself, smiling next to a man who'd planned her murder. Wedding photos, vacation photos, the ultrasound image from her pregnancy. There was so much she'd never get back. Her Uncle Malcolm, the months of terror, the innocence of believing love was always real. But she'd gained something too. Strength, the absolute knowledge that she could survive anything, and a son who would grow up knowing his mother was a fighter. Harper took the photos outside to the fire pit in her backyard. One by one, she burned them. Not out of anger, out of release. The past was ash. The future was open. But as the last photo curled and blackened in the flames, Harper noticed something. An envelope taped to the bottom of the box, one she'd never seen before. She opened it with shaking hands. Inside, a letter, in Malcolm's handwriting. "Harper, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I'm gone, it means Don's trail led somewhere he couldn't let me follow. I'm not afraid of death, kiddo. I'm afraid of leaving you alone with a monster. But I need you to know something. You're stronger than you think. You survived your mother's death when you were 15. You'll survive this too. I've left you everything I found. All my evidence. All my notes. It's in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Key enclosed. Use it if you need it. But more importantly, use that brilliant mind of yours. You're a survivor. Harper, you always have been. Don't let him make you forget that. I love you. Always, Uncle Malcolm." Harper clutched the letter, tears streaming down her face. Even after death, Malcolm had been protecting her. The evidence that had saved her life had been his final gift. "I'm okay," she whispered to the ashes of her past and the ghost of her uncle. "I'm finally okay." The next morning, Harper took Connor to the park. They fed ducks, climbed trees, and ate ice cream cones that dripped in the summer heat. "Mama," Connor asked, chocolate ice cream on his chin, "are you happy?" It was such a simple question, such a profound one. Harper thought about the oxygen tank that had almost killed her, the husband who'd betrayed her, the uncle who'd died protecting her, the years of fear and fighting. And then she thought about this moment, sunshine, her son's laughter, the quiet peace of a life rebuilt from ruins. "Yes, baby," she said, pulling him close. "I'm happy." It wasn't a Hollywood ending. Harper still had nightmares. She still checked the locks obsessively. She'd probably be in therapy for the rest of her life. But she was alive. She was free. And every morning when she woke up and drew breath into her lungs, breath that Don had tried to steal, she felt victory. Not the dramatic courtroom kind, the everyday kind, the kind that comes from surviving Monday and Tuesday and every day after that. Harper Bellamy had been buried alive by lies and manipulation and violence, but she'd clawed her way back to the surface. And now, finally, she could breathe. The oxygen incident had nearly ended her story. Instead, it had been the beginning of a new one, a story about a woman who refused to die, and in the end, that refusal was the most powerful weapon she had.